Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. In Kiev, the Western-backed coup regime in Ukraine appears powerless to stop the rapid collapse of the economy and official structures. The agreed roadmap to de-escalate tensions has gained little traction from the White House and the people of East and South Ukraine. The West started this crisis. Will it be left to Russia to end it? To CrossTalk the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, I'm joined by my guest, Alexander Mercouris in London. He is a writer on legal affairs and an analyst. In San Francisco, we have Mark Hackard. He is an author and columnist for souloftheeast.org. And in Moscow, we cross to Mark Sleboda. He is a senior lecturer and researcher at Moscow State University. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Alexander, if I can go to you first in London, what's going on with this roadmap? At the end of last week, we had this agreement to de-escalate the situation in Ukraine, but over the weekend it rapidly deteriorated in Ukraine. So is it a dead letter?
Well, one has to wonder. I mean, the problem is there was a statement which sets out a roadmap. What there is at the moment is a complete lack of any political will to put it into effect. And it has to be said very clearly that that lack of political will is coming at the moment from Kiev primarily, and also from Washington. The moment the document was signed off, we already saw Washington trying to interpret it in its own terms, as requiring people in the East to leave buildings first, and with threats against Russia, threats of more sanctions, and that is really not helpful in a situation like this.
Mark, in Moscow, unhelpful. That's exactly true here. I mean, it seems hard to believe that Barack Obama was dismissing what his own Secretary of State had negotiated with his counterpart, the Russian foreign minister. I mean, again, is this the kind of diplomacy, quote-unquote diplomacy, we can expect in dealing with this crisis in Ukraine?
Well, I think we've seen a extreme deficit in diplomacy out of the United States, not only in the Ukraine, but for some years now. Politico.com just recently did a piece exposing how the majority of U.S. diplomats within Europe are actually paid, Democratic Party activists who have paid large amounts of money to the Barack Obama's political campaign in order to get those diplomatic seats. Cronies, if you will. The majority of the European capitals, diplomats for the United States, are political cronies of the Democratic Party. And this exposes itself in a complete dearth of professional diplomacy. There are very few professional career diplomats within the U.S. diplomatic service. Now, John Kerry himself can be excluded to this to a certain extent, having a long career in foreign service within the Senate. But overall, on the ground, throughout the rest of Europe and all of the other levels of functionaries within the U.S. diplomatic corps, we have seen a complete deficit of professionalism, of knowledge about the region, and the price for U.S. policy and decision-making has clearly been shown.
Mark, in San Francisco, it seems to me, and please disagree if you disagree with the following, it seems to me Washington really doesn't want a solution. It already has it has a goal, and it wants to achieve that goal, but it has nothing to do with democratic forces or the needs and wants of the Ukrainian people. What it wants to do is it wants to make Russia look like it's at fault here. And if you look at Western media, that's all you're going to hear or read.
Yes, that's true. If you look at what recently happened, you have the massacre in Slavyansk by right sector thugs, and that's not going to get reported in the Western media. Washington really doesn't want a solution to the crisis. It works for them if they can destabilize Russia's periphery. And, you know, what's basically happening is that Washington, London, Paris, but especially Washington/Wall Street, are looking to expand their power as far east as possible, and that's what the Maidan Revolution was about. You know, under slogans of freedom and democracy, they want to strip the country of its assets and move NATO forces and missile defense assets to Russia's southwest frontiers.
Alexander, the interesting thing is, I think back to the breakup of Yugoslavia, the bombing of Serbia, and then thinking in terms of what happened recently in Libya. This is the same game plan. Every single time they go through the same procedure. The difference is in Ukraine, Russia is next door, and Russia has a lot of cards to play. Now, it looks, a lot of people are saying that this is a ploy. They want to trick Russia into some kind of move that will start some kind of conflict, would be very limited, but Russia would be the net loser. Do you see that in your crystal ball?
No, I don't actually. I think that they greatly underestimate Russia's intelligence and sophistication. I think this has been a fundamental problem with the United States looking at Russia. It has a very outdated view of Russia, still based on the 1990s. And I think that anybody looking at the quality of diplomatic service that Russia has and its political leadership, and comparing that with that of the United States, would see that that simply isn't going to happen. Can I just pick up on a point that Mark made? One of the fundamental problems dealing with the United States is that you come up with a statement like the one we saw this week, which in itself could take the thing forward. But what then happens is that people in Washington try to use that statement for propaganda purposes, completely distorting its meaning in order to pursue the agenda that you touched on and which some of the other speakers on our program have touched on. And that, of course, takes us back.
Okay, Mark, in Moscow, you know, I really can't figure this out because on the one hand, it seems to me that Washington really, it has a goal, but it's how it gets there is very ad hoc. They always go back, they're always following news flow and trying to even out the news flow to reflect how they get to their goal. But on the other side, it seems to me that the Russians have prepared for almost every single contingency conceivable, and this is why Washington looks so wobbly all of the time.
Well, I think that from the very beginning of this crisis, the U.S., by openly supporting and fomenting and, by all accounts, funding these Euromaidan riots and putsch in the Ukraine, they have counted on the fact that Russia would simply accept another regime change on their borders, much as Russia did in the color revolution that occurred in Ukraine in 2005. And that Russia, for the sake of maintaining its relations with the West and for the sake of economic relations with the Ukraine as a major trade partner, would accept this change of regime, would accept this geopolitical coup, and would actually fund the putsch regime that the West had just installed there. They had the temerity, William Hague, the British foreign minister, had the temerity to question the Russian government immediately after the putsch took power in Kiev on February 21st and 22nd, if Russia would continue its $15 billion worth of aid to support it. And they act genuinely shocked when Russia, made clear that they wouldn't. So all along there has been this assumption, this misreading of Russia's core national security and identity interests, that they would just accept it. And then the truth is, it was one regime change too many and far too close to Russia's red line security issues.
Mark in San Francisco, Mark in Moscow brings up a very good point. After the illegal coup occurred, look at from the Washington's perspective, they really believe that Russia was going to do nothing. What did they expect Russia to do? I mean, it's on this border. It has national interest there. There are Russian speakers there. There are ethnic Russians there. And Washington truly expected that Vladimir Putin would just say, all right, fine.
Yes, I think that was the case if you look at what happened in the Orange Revolution in 2004, 2005, as Mark in Moscow pointed out. They were expecting that Putin would essentially grin and bear it, but they were basically they wanted history to repeat itself, and they thought that the Ukraine would become essentially an economic satrapy of the European Union, that they could kick out in some period of time the Black Sea Fleet from Sevastopol, and they were probably genuinely surprised when Russia secured Crimea and shifted the agenda so that it turned out that the West was off balance, that the U.S. Was not setting the tune for geopolitics in Eastern Europe.
Let me
anymore.
go to Alexander real quick before we go to the break. Alexander, it seems to me through this entire crisis, the West never believes in the agency of the Ukrainian people. It has to have fascists leading the revolution in Maidan,
Exactly.
and people in the East simply don't exist.
Well, indeed, that's absolutely the case. The trouble is, I mean, we're talking about the US perception. The US does not have a realistic understanding of the Ukraine. It does not have a realistic understanding of Russia. Russia does have a realistic understanding of the Ukraine. That is why Russia is being much more effective in its dealings of the Ukraine than the US is, and why the US is getting into bed with some extremely violent,
Okay, on that note there, we're going to return to that. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Ukraine. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. Okay, I'd like to go back to Mark here in Moscow. When I talked about Ukraine's agency, the agency of the Ukrainian people, you really perked up there. Do you want to follow up?
Yeah, I think that this has been really crucial to understanding the plans and the policies of both the Western countries and this putsch regime that they have helped install and backed in Kiev, is this denying of political agency and even of the very existence of the people of South and East Ukraine. This has been instrumental. We have to remember that this putsch regime has absolutely no constitutional, legal, or democratic legitimacy. It was installed at the back of violent street protests, mobs, at the hands of an ultra-nationalist vanguard that murdered police, young men in uniform, on the streets of Kiev in order to seize power. So in order to help legitimize this, as much as the word
Mark
could be
here
used.
in Moscow.
Yeah.
Mark, that's not true. I didn't hear that on CNN. I didn't hear that on BBC. I didn't read that in the Washington Post. I didn't see it in the New York Times. So,
Yeah, well,
it must have not happened, right?
That brings up an even better point, is how the Western press has been complicit in this entire process. And they really share a great deal of the blame, because they are on there right now on the streets of Donetsk, Slavyansk, and the other cities in the east and south, where Russian-orientated protesters are. And they're not just Russian ethnic or Russian speaking. I prefer to call them Russian-orientated, because there are people, for the reasons of identity, for reasons of political and cultural orientation, be they Russian ethnic, be they Ukrainian ethnic, be they primarily of Soviet identity, they look towards Russia for direction and for their identity. And it has been instrumental, the press has been instrumental in this process of denying that they're there. They keep insisting on this mythology propagated by both the putsch regime and the Western governments, that this is all due to mysterious Russian agents, men in green, that neither CNN nor CBS nor NBC or the BBC have been able to find a single Russian agent on the ground there. They've talked to hundreds of people, and they still can't find any Russian agents. The only agents that we know for sure that are interfering in the politics of the Ukraine at this moment are the CIA, who have visited and who are operating out of a floor of the Ukrainian Intelligence Committee in Kiev.
You know, Mark in San Francisco, from the very, very beginning, I've said this is really more about a media war here, because according to Western media, there are no fascists, and the people in the East are just victims of Russian aggression. But the fact of the matter is that there are known fascists and ultra-nationalist anti-Semites in this government, unelected government in Kiev, but it's almost never, ever talked about, except for the people in the East are being duped by Russians. For heaven's sake, a lot of them are Russian. You don't have to motivate these people. If people like the Red Sector are coming to your town, you're going to get ready.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, that's the funny thing. The media, the Western media, CNN, Fox News, whoever, will call protesters in the East who, as Mark pointed out, for reasons of cultural, ethnic, religious identity, look to Russia for guidance. They will call them, let's
well, they're
remember
called,
some of the words.
Insurgents.
Terrorists.
They call them
rebels.
terrorists.
Yeah. They're straight out called terrorists. Whereas the people on the Maidan, the urban fighters who were shooting at cops and throwing Molotov cocktails were known as peaceful protesters, and that's still the case. And those peaceful protesters, the core of that was Right Sector. And today, yes, Right Sector, with this ideology that derives from the doctrines of Stepan Bandera, they are in the government. Dmitry Yarosh, who is running for president, is on the Defense and National Security Council. You have other people like Oleg
I'd like to also point out that this gentleman, Yarosh, he is appointing people all throughout the country to positions of influence that have to do with security. He's spreading his venom here. Alexander, let me go to you. It was so wonderful to have you here in Moscow a few weeks ago, and we talked quite a bit about what's going on in Ukraine. Square the circle for me here. Now, these Red Sector people, or Right Sector people, they cannot be elected. They just don't have the electoral power. They can't seem to keep the country together. The economy is going into free fall. So when the European Union watches this upcoming election, is the European Union going to call it right, or are they just going to make sure they get their friends in power?
Well, they're going to make sure that they get their friends in power. I mean, this has been the consistent pattern, unfortunately, in elections in the former Soviet bloc since 1991. I happen to know that there was an election in Croatia some years ago, back in the 90s, which went wrong as far as the European Union was concerned, and the Monitor's report about it was suppressed. And of course, in 1996, in Russia, Mr. Yeltsin was said to have won, even though everybody knows he lost. The point about the election that's going to happen in the Ukraine is that it's not really an election at all. Two of the candidates, Mr. Tsarev and Mr. Dobkin, were recently assaulted because they're considered to be, by the Right Sector, too close to the protesters in the East. The purpose of this election is to legitimize the seizure of power that took place in Kiev on the 22nd of February. And I think that's an important point to make, because I agree with you completely. The dominant groups within the government, at least on the military side, Right Sector and the rest, would certainly not be able to win power to the extent that they have it now in any conceivable democratic election. If you see the support they have, it's usually around 1 or 2%.
Mark, in Moscow, so what kind of democracy is the EU in Washington building in Ukraine? Because this is their mantra, okay? This is how they spread their power. You would have an election. I call it an election fetish. And in the European Union, they just keep having elections until they get the right answer. Can we expect the same in Ukraine?
Well, for any of your viewers, and I think RT viewers are a little bit more internet savvy than most, who have managed to avoid the blackout of the Western mainstream media on the issue, who watch RT or who are paying close attention to the videos or of the Ukraine crisis. There was a video that showed a group of right sector thugs walked into a local council meeting about a month ago, just outside Kiev, a local political council, with armed to the teeth, wearing masks, and taking position behind a number of the politicians with sledgehammers and axes. They seized the microphone and insisted that everyone there who was a member of one of the previous government's coalition parties, that is the Party of Regions or the Communist Party, resign. That is the type of democracy that is being built in the Ukraine. These, quote, elections, unquote, that are coming up, that the putsch is trying to use to legitimize itself. We have had the Communist Party leader be physically assaulted by Sleboda Party members on the floor of the Rada when he tried to raise objection to the putsch's policies of sending the military against their own citizens in the east. The Communist Party headquarters in Kiev has been looted and burned to the ground. The Communist Party leader's home has also been burned. One of the first legislative actions of this putsch Rada was to ban the Communist Party, although that has not actually been put into law for obvious reasons. Party of Regions offices have been looted and burned across the country. Party of Regions officials have been lynched in public. And now we've had the beatings, multiple beatings of the two presidential candidates who are not represented by the Euromaidan putsch, one of them to within an inch of his life. And the perpetrators are right-wing, these right-sector fascist paramilitaries that are supportive and supported by this putsch regime. So let's not talk of democracy. This has gone beyond democracy into direct fascism.
Mark, to find some kind of solution to what's going on in Ukraine, Russia has to be part of the end game here. When is that going to happen? Because on the one hand, Washington and Brussels keep threatening the stick, but you know, Russia has all of the carrots to take care of this. I was hoping for a long time we could go back to February 21st, but that seems to be impossible right now. Does the European Union and Washington really want to stand shoulder to shoulder with these really gruesome people? Because it's coming out. It's in social media, on the internet. Okay, maybe the networks and the broadsheets don't want to talk about it, but it's there and it's coming to light.
Yes, they are standing shoulder to shoulder with thugs, and there's precedent for this. In the Ukraine, the United States and certain European powers, especially Britain, of course, use these movements like Right Sector and Sleboda to achieve their aims, to take power, just as they use terrorists, jihadists in Syria, or against Russia itself. They will promote
Libya
movements for cultural disintegration, sexual deviance like Pussy Riot. So you see there these vectors of subversion, and Western intelligence will use these people against Russia for its geopolitical agenda. The agenda in Ukraine.
It's very interesting. We have to jump in. We've run out of time. Everything we've talked about here doesn't seem to help the Ukrainian people. They're the one in crisis. Many thanks to my guests today in London, San Francisco, and in Moscow. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk works.
I love you.